what is authenticity, sort of philosophers yell at their podcasting device at this moment. But we'll come back to that. What really brought the world of Catfish bands to my attention was and I'm doing bunny ears here, inverted commas, a Chinese black gaze act called Ghost Bath.
Hey folks, welcome to the Unsung Podcast. I'm Mark, joined by my colleague, friend, cult leader, Chris.
Come on, there's got to be another title in there somewhere.
The Honourable Chris Cusack.
I'm not going. I would reject any royal titles. I know they're probably in the post at some point, you know, given how long we've been at this.
Yeah, it's inevitable.
The establishment's bound to take notice at some point.
Yeah.
But no, I'm afraid when the king comes knocking, I'll be pretending I'm out.
Aye.
Yep.
Going to do the old Michael Sheen, just give it back.
Yeah. The boy not refuse as well.
I think he did. A few folk have refused.
Yeah. John Lennon,
rightly so. They should, because fuck them.
absolutely. GIRFUY.
Get right fucking up.
Charlie.
That's a interesting intro to this episode. So what are we doing this week, Chris?
We are going to cover. I mean, I've tried to get a working title for this. It was one of the hardest things about doing this podcast is coming up with the titles that aren't just pure eye rolls. Okay, so permission to roll your eyes, folks. But Catfish core. I mean, you add core to the end of anything whenever you can't think of what else to call it. Or hoax rock, hoax metal in this case. Clearly, music is a lot to do with assumed personae and going in character, out of character, especially in rock, you know, the more theatrical stuff, especially metal. But we're not talking about that. So a fair portion of the start of this episode is going to be spent disambiguating what we're actually talking about. Before we really get into the weeds of that, we've got some admin that we have to do.
Yeah, as ever, if you're a fan of this podcast, please subscribe to our Patreon. It's patreon.com/unsungpod. And for £4 a month or whatever the local I mean, we've not put it up, have we? For a long
we
time.
are not following inflation.
And but you can join for £4 or whatever your local currency equivalent is, and you can get access to our back catalogue.
Our houses.
Our houses, yes. Us. I was going to say us.
I wasn't really sure what you were going to...
I was going to say us, but then I kind of stopped halfway there. You get access to bonus content, our Facebook group, which we still have.
God, I hate having to say that. But
it's good. It's good.
A good way to interact. Yeah. We've got a closed group for people that are in the AAA unsung subscribers thing, and it means they can suggest episodes, interact generally. We had some cool stuff this week, a really unusual compilation thrown at us yesterday. Had some funky stuff in it.
Yeah.
But it's a good way to kind of give us some feedback or suggestions, and we do cover the stuff.
So that's where you can just, you know, have an influence in the show if you really like it. So £4 a month, patreon.com/.
So effectively, if you want us to listen to you, pay us. That's basically what we're saying.
Yeah. And something that we did before last year was an episode on the Dazzling Killmen. And we might be following that up with something else later on this year. That'll be fun.
We've also taken to try and kind of be a bit more regular. We are going through our own catalogue because, I mean, I assembled it the other day. It was 422 episodes, as well as some odds and ends. But some of those are becoming increasingly relevant again, so we are going to reissue Short Paris in light of the vocalist's death.
Well, actually, it will have been reissued.
Oh, of course it will. Yes. Yeah. So you'll have noticed that. Hopefully, we're kind of listening back through our own stuff, which is quite a weird experience.
Don't like it.
Making little intros and notes on it. So these will all be kind of curated. We're not just randomly picking them. We're trying to have a bit of a pattern here. Certainly some of them are our favourites. So when they pop up, it's because we either really like them for one reason or another, or because we think there's something nutritious within them that is relevant or merits sort of revisiting. So even if you did listen to the episodes prior, I genuinely would say some of them in particular are really worth listening to again. You get other stuff out of them. And if you're somebody that's joined the show at a later date, then hopefully it's a good way for you to know some of the highlights, because that early catalogue is pretty daunting, even for us.
Yeah. So hopefully you enjoyed the Short Paris episode, and we'll figure out what's coming next week. We don't quite know yet, but it'll be something that
well, a
we
lot of
love,
it's based on the news and things like that, because that Short Paris one suggested itself when the vocalist passed away. So yeah, we'll try and make them as relevant as possible.
So speaking of passing away, some artists that have had hoaxes attached to them
It's tenuous, like, my goodness.
Well, there is one which we're going to get to quite early on if we're going to do a little bit of the history of this thing.
Talking about Elvis.
Talking about not just Elvis, but also Paul McCartney. Paul is dead. That famous hoax.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so there was that too. But yeah, before we dive deep into what that actually, like, hoax bands, hoaxcore, whatever, we kind of need to talk about what we're not talking about.
Yeah. So I mean, who doesn't love a bit of mystery? You know, I think certainly, other than the peak hipster merchandising opportunities that they represent, that's kind of the secret of Banksy's success, isn't it? You know, just the intrigue around it. And by the way, Banksy identity solved.
Oh, really?
I know, and I know that's something that you'll see from time to time, and people will be like, "Oh, it's the guy for this band." And no, if you want to know, buy me a pint. I'm not going to say it on air because it's currency. It's worth something. I know everyone thinks I'm talking shit here, but I'm not.
I know the story. I've heard the story.
Yeah, but I mean, there are other assumed identities in popular culture over the centuries, actually, that are either a practical decision or maybe making a kind of salient cultural point. George Eliot, anybody? There we go. That's a good example, I think, of what we're maybe going to touch on today. Somebody that's had to operate under a different identity, in that case for societal reasons, but also to enable their product to succeed. And neither Banksy nor George Eliot are scams. That's not what we're saying. But the line can be fine at times, maybe even subjective. You know, some people might see one as a scam and others as, you know, a fair comment. There's plenty of obfuscated identities, and they are a lasting part of the appeal of that work as well. You know,
some of the biggest acts in the world just now have got that going on. You know?
And as I say, just historically, you know, but others are not so wholesome. I think we can agree on that. We should give a good nod to Stereogum, amongst others, but Stereogum in particular, and a writer, Al Shipley, for some really good pieces on this that we've drawn from. The subject as well was something that we sort of touched on during our Velvet Sundown episode. If you've not heard that episode, folks, go back and listen to it. That is the AI band that caused such a stir. And a big part of it was because, are they real? And then the surprise that, they're not real, but yet they have this entire fabricated backstory. So it was really about dangling notions of authenticity. What is authenticity? Sort of philosophers yell at their podcasting device at this moment. But we'll come back to that AI in a moment. It is a tangential issue to what we were exploring this week. What really brought the world of Catfish bands to my attention was and I'm doing bunny ears here, inverted commas, a Chinese black gaze act called Ghost Bath. And we'll talk about them in a lot of detail later on in the podcast, as they represent for me, a very specific manifestation of the phenomenon. But as you say, let's start in time-honoured, diligent, unsung podcast fashion by explaining what we're not talking about. Okay, so what is this not? Well, the first thing I would say it's not is musical aliases or roleplay. So David Bowie, aka Ziggy Stardust, aka the Thin White Duke, aka David Robert Jones. You know, it's not that. It's not Lana Del Rey, you know, aka Lizzie Grant. Also, by the way, aka May Jailer, which was an earlier alias that she released a particular, is it Sirens it's called? There's like an acoustic album that was sort of an aborted acoustic album that eventually leaked years later. That was a previous pseudonym she was using. It's not multiple project titles that are used by the same person. So Richard D. James, Aphex Twin, AFX. It's not that. It's not in a similar vein, you know, J.G. Thirlwell, aka Clint Ruin, Frank Want, probably best known as Fetus, as well as Scraping Fetus Off the Wheel, multiple different titles. Okay, it's not that, right? And even I think you'd pointed out Jandek, again, someone that had 120 albums or something like that. You know,
still going, man. He's still at it.
Yeah, loads of stuff that is, you know, got alternative names and stuff. It's not that. Okay, it's not that.
Well, for a long time he was anonymous, but it's come to light over the last like 20 or 30 years who this person is, and he's got this really weird habit of just playing shows without even announcing them, just turning up other people's shows and playing like his songs, which is pretty
appearing
weird.
On stage. People from Glasgow actually have performed with me. He did a show here. Was it Tectonics he was part of? But yeah. And it's not bands who are playing with anonymity. So some examples would be like Mr. Bungle initially, for a while anyway, Slipknot for a while, Gorillaz sort of for a while. You know, it's kind of like, oh, they're in it, but who else is in it? And, you know, Keith Allen, I think, was involved with Gorillaz. That kind of like cross format thing was quite intriguing. Daft Punk sort of for a while. Sleep Token, hopefully not for very long.
Well, it takes you like 2 seconds to Google to find out who they are, or who the guy's a singer, the guy that writes everything. Vessel,
and then was it 2, 3, and 4 or something like that?
So he is, like there's videos and stuff of like his old projects and all that. So you can find out who it is. By the same token, President as well. Everybody kind of knows that Charlie Simpson from Busted, but
yeah, that's that's a more recent one, isn't it? Yeah, Ghost BC, depending on where you're from.
Tobias Forge, but I think that's all.
Papa Emeritus second. It accidentally,
and the 5th and the 4th, and all of it. I think
accidentally outed though by, was it Behemoth?
It was, that's right.
It was an Instagram post or something like that. But the thing is, it was pretty well known, but it just wasn't official. You know, you could find it out, as you say, if you really wanted to know. But some people, you know, they kind of don't really want to know that much. It's not all that relevant. And I think that's something that you know, makes that category of playing under anonymity kind of different. You know, it's not really that relevant. You know, there's not really a deception. It's just part of the project. A good one actually, maybe a bit more obscure, would be Silicon Teens. So a guy, Daniel Miller, set up Mute Records. I think it was in 1978 he did that, and then he signed amazing stuff, you know, Depeche Mode, Birthday Party, Einsterzender and About, and people like that. Very respected label. He originally set it up, I believe, to release his own stuff under his own name, and I don't really know why. He was also releasing stuff under this title, Silicon Teens, which was like more of a band sounding thing, like post-punky, I think. He didn't want to be known as being part of the band. So it was the front person of Fad Gadget, Frank Tovey, who was posing as the singer of this project, and then they literally hired actors to be the other band members. And I don't really know what the reasoning was behind that. I don't know the project well enough, but it is quite an interesting part of that project. That it was like, all right, okay, so there's some kind of weird allure and mystique around this thing. So yeah, Silicon Teens. Another thing we're not talking about are like sneaky franchises and stand-ins, but this is a very interesting like tangent here. The Zombies, you brought this to my attention. The Zombies 1, 2, and 3. You want to explain this, unpack this a bit, because it's intriguing.
So basically, the Zombies are most well known for. By the way, they've got over 2.5 million plays on Spotify, which is absolutely wild. But they were a band. They were an actual band.
Time of the Season is one of the iconic songs of that era now. Yeah. By the way, they'd already split up when that song became a hit.
So I was going to say, so they formed in 1962 and it didn't really achieve any success with their first album.
Hey, they were British, right?
Yeah, the British band. And then somehow in 1967, Time of the Season went to number 3 in the Billboard chart, which was weird. The band had like long broken up, but
they had jobs. They'd like chucked music and they were going and working in the supermarket.
Yeah, so after they did the final album and then they just kind of vanished, and then after that song had hit the Billboard charts, their US label, Date Records, sort of released it as a last ditch effort, even though it's like, well, the band aren't around. Somebody saw an opportunity to make some money, and that was a management company or promotions company called Delta Promotions, run by Bill Cahill and Jim Atherton. And they thought, you know what, let's capitalise on this by creating 2 groups called the Zombies and send them both out on tour in America. So you had the Texas Zombies, which actually this is such a good nexus, right? The Texas Zombies had Dusty Hill and Frank Beard from ZZ Top in it before ZZ Top was a thing, which is wild.
Without beards as well. Frank Beard without a beard.
Yeah.
Or is Frank Beard the one that doesn't have a beard?
Frank Beard's the
anyway?
one without the beard.
Yeah, the other one, Hill.
Hill,
He's not got a beard in the photos. It's weird.
And then the Michigan Zombies, which was consisted of
Michigan?
which consisted of a member.
So the Mexican
the
Zombies.
Mexican Zombies, a Beach Boys inspired band called the XLs, and apparently they were much more convincing. So the Texas Zombies were like a blues band, which the real Zombies are not. But the Michigan Zombies were a bit more authentic, I guess. And it wasn't really until I think it was the bass player of the band had kind of like heard through the grapevine, because it was the 60s, like no one's going to know that somebody was doing this, and then there was a bit of a legal kerfuffle. Chris White discovered the operation, and Rolling Stone in '69 he said that they're dragging down the band's reputation. An imposter who claimed to be the guitarist, an imposter who claimed to be the original drummer, was interviewed by a journalist, and then it was just a whole thing, and then it was just a weird little time, and this promotion were at it, they did it with the Animals as well, the House of the Rising Sun, the Animals.
Of course,
it wasn't until what was it? Eric Burden threatened them with a baseball bat, basically, the guys that ran Delta Promotions, for doing an impersonation of the Animals.
Yeah.
And the Archies, which is like a sort of, they're taking the music for the cartoon on the road, basically.
Yeah.
And they got into trouble off the producer from the franchise as well. So within a year, the whole operation had wrapped up.
The thing is, that's still a practice now, to have multiple iterations of bands to tour in different territories. It still goes on, sometimes on purpose, sometimes a bit snidely. And there's an inverse of that as well, where, in that case, it's really dodgy with the Zombies actually not knowing and not getting a cut. But then, was that not a big part of MF Doom, was that he used to send people out in a mask to perform?
He had done it a few times, yeah.
And they'd be a foot shorter than him, and the crowd would be going absolutely tonto, because they'd know straight away that that's not MF Doom.
Yeah. It's weird that, I think, for him, that's probably, a lot of fans were unhappy about it. And you would be right, if you're going to go see MF Doom, you want to see MF Doom. But it's also kind of part of his persona and his character. It's just fucking with people.
It is quite punk, but you wouldn't be exactly pleased with that.
I remember reading about it in NME stuff at the time.
Yeah, I've seen a video of a riot at one of the gigs, and the guy is tiny compared to MF Doom. But there's also I think you mentioned Boney M and
Milli Vanilli.
But I think that's a different. We'll come to that in a second. But
same guy.
There's a lot. Same writer. There's a lot of bands on the go where the membership of the band has very little to do, or very little to do with the membership that made it famous, or the consistency of it. I mean, even a lot of the hip hop bands from the early 80s are just almost all ringers now. I mean, the son of this or the cousin of that, or there's multiple versions of the same group vying for the title of using that. Is it the Temptations and bands like that? They're just complete shadows of what they used to be.
Boney M is quite interesting though, isn't it? Because Frank Fedden is a guy we're talking about. He recreated the project and sang all the low parts, and then brought in female singers, and then just hired a band to be to hire the band to be like Boney M. And some of the songs that they have are legendary. Daddy Cool, Rasputin, all that kind of stuff. It's is it Mary's Boy Child? Is that the? Did they do that as well?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. Did they not do the Rivers of Babylon?
They did that as well. Yeah. But people knew it. It was accepted in the 70s that this was a sort of smoke and mirrors kind of thing, which is really interesting. It was all, the disco era was all about theatre, really, as well, so people were a bit more forgiving about that back then.
Yeah, it definitely changed. So another thing that we're not talking about are concept bands. Okay, so the first one that jumps into my head is Gwar, right? Are Gwar actually aliens? No. Bombshell? No, they're not. Are we meant to believe they are? No. No, we're not. That's not a deception because it's so absurd. It's kind of the legal standard of satire. A reasonable person is not meant to think that Gwar are actually aliens.
I watched the rig rundown for Gwar on Premier Guitar's YouTube channel, and one guitar player is really fucking committed to the bit. He's acting like he's from another world. also like a total kind of dude bro, but like just when he demonstrates his guitar effects and his pedals and that, doesn't even play, just makes noises with his guitar. He's like, but then the other guy who I think is a founding member, the other guitar player, like he's very straight, even though he's like wearing all the gear. He's very much like, this is my stuff, and this is what I use. You know, and it's like complete opposite.
Well, people that are talking about people that are very committed to the bit, the Residents, they're a really interesting example. So right from the start, rumours circulated that they were actually the members of the Beatles, just having fun in a different project. The band's status, I think, straddling art and music as they do, because they're not a strictly musical venture. There's a lot more going on with the
visual art and all that.
Yeah, exactly. And they were part of that scene. It was called the Haight-Ashbury kind of whole thing. So it's always made the mischief with them feel a little bit more relevant and part of the brand. When they actually started assuming titles and, you know, coming out with names, albeit not their birth names, but they apparently this is when they started having the most issues with consistent membership, with people breaking away to do their own things here and there. But they also extended the concept of just the band to things like the label, the Cryptic Corporation, which is obviously a nod to the mystique around the band. Even their manager, Homer Flynn, the spokesperson, you know, it was a lot of like suspicious, like a lot of kind of, oh, is he not the guy that writes and starts the band, but he's now pretending just to be their manager, and you know, it's like fascinating that there's Hardy Fox, who was in the band as well, used the name Charles Bobuck, came out, I'll use that phrase, as their primary songwriter, at least for a while. But I think the whole web of madness around that band means it's hard to argue that you were expected to take anything too literally. It's not a deceit in the sense of someone's trying to game you for an advantage, you know. By the way, the band's also, as a result of that anonymity, have been able to play with like people coming in and out that are quite famous in other bands, like Les Claypool's rumoured to have been in them for a bit. Mark Mothersbaugh from Devo and Rugrats was in them for a bit. I think even members of the Dead Kennedys were supposed to have played with them. Another one as well that I found a bit more contemporary, Max Creeps.
Yeah, I saw this the other day.
Band that never actually existed, ? You know, like they had this whole announcement of like splitting after 40 years together, and there was all these people coming out, and like Billy Joe Armstrong, for example.
Christina Aguilera, Mick Jagger, you know, they had a documentary about them. Like,
really, really fascinating sort of project here. But it seems like it was
Duff McKagan.
That was
it sounds like him. I mean, the music's
and
not
members of the
but
Fastbacks, and Duff McKagan came from Seattle, so that would kind of make sense. But I think maybe even Slash was in the project as well. And it's kind of clever marketing in that case. I think, you know, it's like a bit of kind of harmless fun. Obviously using some of his contacts and stuff to puff it up a wee bit, but there's a bit of wry reflection as well on the vanity of pop music and scenesterism and connection. It's actually a pretty cool project. I mean, haven't listened to it.
Can I just throw in a contemporary story whilst we're talking about this?
Yeah.
Contemporary-ish story. There's a band called Masked Intruder, who are like a sort of pop punk, Ramones core.
Yes.
Also, like, write a lot of love songs about, and like a lot of stuff about being in jail and all that. It's quite fun. I interviewed one of their band members, and I remember sitting in the back of their tour van, like interviewing him, and he's wearing his green balaclava, like talking in his like fake New Jersey accent, and then after it's finished, he takes it off and just reverts to a human being. It was just so bizarre to see. Afterwards, I went into the bar, which is the 13th Note, God rest his soul. I started speaking to an American guy at the bar who was really tall, and I was like, "Are you in the band?" And he was like, "Maybe." I was supposed to interview the singer, but the singer wasn't feeling too well. But then the singer came out and he walked up to me and he's like, "Are you Mark?" And I was like, "Yes, I'm so sorry, man. I'm not feeling great, so that's why I didn't do the interview." And then we just sat at the bar drinking, and like he obviously straight away had like outed himself.
Aye.
And the drummer, it was the drummer who I was talking to, standing next to me. I just seen the look in his face, like as if the whole facade had just like crumbled right in front of him. It's like he's trying to play it cool and be a bit aloof, even though it's an American guy in the 13th Note. You're like, well, there's only one reason you're going to be here, mate. But,
probably,
yeah. But it was just, it was so funny because clearly the singer was just like, I don't give a fuck. I'm just like,
it's different members are in different places in terms of their seriousness to their commitment to the bit, right? So yeah, we'll go back to what we mentioned in passing earlier on with Velvet Sundown. AI, as we have highlighted in the past, AI musical projects love nothing better than dancing around the issue or whether they actually have skin and bones. And I guess, to be fair, that is part of the challenge around AI much more broadly. It's the Turing test, right? It's, can it pass for human? And so...
And it can?
It can.
Worryingly.
There's an incentive to deceive on one hand, because it makes, gives the music an authenticity, again, inverted commas, quotation marks. I'll use that instead.
Same thing.
Same thing, yeah.
That's I think, yeah, people use it interchangeably.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's that whole kind of passing kind of aspect of it that then makes it potentially quite valuable. But there is also simply the technological challenge of making something sophisticated enough that it can be passed as human, and therefore you can kind of say, well, I was just sort of, I'm a scientist, I'm a music scientist, I'm trying to make this work. But there's definitely a bit of dishonesty in pursuit of financial gain. I mean, clearly we can't go into it and shouldn't go into it in detail because we have a whole episode where we deep dive on this, the Velvet Sundown episode. I really encourage you to go and listen to that, because especially in certain genres, country is the one that we really identified, and as well as ambient and soundtrack and stuff now.
Dance music as well.
There's so much money to be made, so much money to be made, licensing money as well for like background tracks and stuff from pretending to be real, and clearly places like Spotify have been done because people discovered that there were entire artists who were just uploading auto-generated music, kind of pretending to be legitimate artists, and then raking in massive amounts of money on the back of that.
And we did that episode, like 8 months ago or something like that?
Yeah.
And maybe even a year ago now. And it's even better now.
Yeah.
You hear the vocals are always the tell. Like,
that's right.
It's not that big of a deal now. One thing I just want to bring up, which we can...
Well, can we just say as well, as a development, some of the platforms have now banned AI music on their platforms.
I don't think Bandcamp allows it.
No, I don't think they do. I think Tidal banned it as well, didn't they?
Yeah.
Or was it Deezer? Maybe it was Deezer.
I think Deezer they were noting it on
right,
that.
okay.
Yeah, I don't know if they banned it, but if you there's a whole subreddit of Suno users that are just that think they're artists.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose whether you want to get into the minutiae of whether someone that's like really good at writing prompts is an artist or not, I suppose it's a completely different conversation for another day, which we're not going to have right now. But it is mind blowing to me when like people go, oh well, I'm so good at doing this. Like there's people on Twitter that are like pure AI like boosters, man, who just think that they are like, if they're using it to create visual art, for example, or music, that they are the same as people like you and I, a lot of people listen to this podcast, that people that create art with their bare hands, and for me that's kind of troubling because, well, maybe we need to have a discussion as a society more broadly around what that actually means to be an artist, but I don't think there's much honour, honestly, in that,
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree. And talking about dishonourable things, we're also not talking about outright scams. So there's a couple of really good examples here. And the first one I want to mention is a bit of an older example. Fritz Kreisler. He's an Austrian violinist who was really celebrated in the early 20th century. And he enjoyed particular success on the backs of having supposedly unearthed like lost works by like Bach. I think it was Vivaldi as well. And he discovered them again, inverted commas, in obscure locations. So monasteries, I think, in one case, and in others, like, going into the back offices of libraries and digging through manuscripts and stuff like that. And in 1930, I think it was 1935, something like that, a New York Times interviewer just thought to ask him, did you write these? And his answer was ambiguous, but like, the simple fact of it not being an aghast denial caused a scandal. The thing is, this guy was actually already quite a celebrated musician, but he definitely did this to secure wider coverage. Regardless of his existing success, he chose to gain an advantage via these means. Although apparently it was kind of in keeping with him. He was known for liking a bit of mischief. Another one would be, you mentioned the name earlier on, Milli Vanilli. So two models, basically, from Germany, I think.
Because Frank Ferry's German, so...
Yeah, so they weren't playing or performing or singing at all. They were up and they were miming that was clearly missold, made a lot of money at the time.
Won a Grammy.
Yeah, won a Grammy, kind of like up in the charts, but it became quite a scandal, like quite a kind of exemplifies a particular kind of scandal.
Well, I don't think that this is. I think that falls in the category of hoax, to be honest, because Frank Farian was just replicating a formula which he had a lot of success with in the 70s and doing it, and I guess in that contemporary era in the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
I don't think it was hugely like. It's probably one of those things that ran away when it started to become really big. You know, maybe people in the know would have been like, "Well, he's clearly writing that and he's singing it as well," like because you can hear his voice in this 70s disco music. So it's not like a huge. I don't think it's a huge scam, even though it was treated as such back then.
I think it's very unlikely people would be able to identify a voice to a voice. No, I mean, I think it was quite patently dishonest, and he just saw an opportunity to do something and thought he'd take a swing at it. And the repercussions were probably going to be minimal, given that he was probably going to get some money in his pocket, and probably still does.
He wrote a lot of great songs, though. He was a really good songwriter.
I think it's important. My caveat to it would be slightly different. It would be that what Milli Vanilli were done for is maybe a more extreme, but only slightly more extreme version of what many of the world's most famous pop stars do routinely now, which is to say that they pretend to write their music, but they don't write their music. They pretend to sing their music, and in many, many cases, they don't sing their music. They pretend to perform their music live, and in many, many cases, they either don't perform it live, or it's so heavily processed and affected that you could effectively say they're not really doing it live. And that is par for the course now. So what Milli Vanilli represent is so routine now that it's difficult for me to get too worked up about it. Really, I think arguably the political slant that's put on, I'm trying not to name names because anyone that knows me will roll their eyes, right? But the political slant that is put on certain acts now in terms of their advocacy work, when it's fraudulent, like effectively, when they're not writing that music, they're not this supremely talented being that they pass themselves off as, that they have a team of hundreds, thousands of people that make that music and enable them to look and sing and sound and appear like that. That to me is truly like both dishonest and actually a bit more odious, because they are unattainably wonderful human beings that people then measure themselves against. And in an era that is, I think, you know, the rising phenomenon of eating disorders and, you know, the Instagram effect of people's low self-esteem, you know, being impacted by unattainable lifestyles and photoshopped things and airbrushed things. It's like, it just contributes to the weight of like how much we all feel we fall so far short of these godlike beings. And in fact, these godlike beings are the Wizard of Oz. They're just like, they're a fabrication. And so I think it's actually more pernicious now than with Milli Vanilli. I think there was a stupidity, a clownishness to Milli Vanilli. There was no political agenda. They weren't holding themselves up as like great, you know, upright citizens out there fighting the good fight. They were just a couple of like handsome douchebags getting paid. I think it's as I say, more sinister now. Straddling the borderlands though between, let's say, scam, anonymity, mischief, and social commentary, there are a few. So I do want to correct you. You mentioned earlier on, you mentioned Christina Aguilera and stuff like that. It wasn't the right person you were referring to, but come back to that. One is the Masked Marauders.
Yep.
Now this is actually just an elaborate Rolling Stone magazine prank. So,
Totally a hoax.
Total hoax, yeah. So they basically reviewed an album, like they sort of like, as a joke, threw together this band called the Masked Marauders, and it was supposed to be like Bob Dylan, John Lennon, Mick Jagger. They got a bunch of impersonators eventually to do this. And it was only really meant to be an article and sort of have a bit of mischief with their readers. But eventually the album came into being because they hired this band. They were called the Cleanliness and Godliness Skiffle Band. Very moderately successful, if that, you know. They recorded an album and then they got vocalists, you know, impersonators to do these voices. And then it turned out there was actual label interest in this because there was such a buzz around it. Warner Brothers ended up winning whatever race there was to get the rights. And they released an actual album. And the album itself, like the sleeve notes, were littered with all these kind of jokes and nods and winks. I think there was even an angry voice on the record of somebody who'd picked up the album and was like, when I get hold of them, blah, blah. You know, there's a lot of stuff in it that was clearly, but you'd already paid your money by that point. I think the liner notes had the phrase in it, in a world of sham, the Masked Marauders, bless their hearts, are the genuine article. Had they remained a conceptual prank, I think it probably wouldn't be in this Borderlands category that I'm suggesting here. But by signing to Warner and by releasing albums for sale and taking people's money, I think the nature of that prank changed somewhat. Another would be Orion.
Orion, yeah.
You want to unpack Orion?
Yeah, Orion. Wow. Basically, after Elvis died, there was a conspiracy theory. Elvis lives.
Oh, you're kidding.
Yeah. Wow.
Never heard that one.
I know. And somebody saw an opportunity to make a little bit of money off of this. A chap called James Hughes Bell, later named James Hodges Ellis for some reason, don't know why. Yep. Was a really good Elvis impersonator. His voice is, if you like, I think the biggest song on Spotify is Hillbilly Rockabilly Rebel, and it sounds a bit like a shit Elvis, because it is a shit Elvis.
Shelvis.
Yeah. And he kind of resembled him partly as well. That's why he wore the mask, right?
Mask,
that's why he wears. So he wears a rhinestone and studied mask basically. In 1972, a Florida producer called Finlay Duncan sent a recording of Ellis to a guy called Shelby Singleton, who had recently purchased the Sun Records catalogue from Sam Phillips, and they basically got a bit of interest in Orion, kind of this guy who's an Elvis impersonator.
Was it not like something to do with, it was like Jerry Lee Lewis records that had another voice on them that sounded incredibly like Elvis Presley, and people were sort of like, oh, who is this? Is this actually Elvis Presley that's singing on this?
That's right, yeah. And, you know, RCA Records actually believed that Singleton had lost the masters, the Sun Records masters, and they had to do a voice print analysis on the Sun Records masters to prove that it was Elvis. But that still didn't really stop, you know, this gimmick from kind of taking off afterwards. And yeah, like, he released his debut album Orion Reborn in 1979.
Yeah.
And like you said, it was the Ellis's vocals with some Jerry Lee Lewis masters that Singleton had found in the Sun Records catalogue. It was going to release them as Jerry Lee and Friends, but he ended up not, and he did it under Orion instead.
Yeah.
It was a huge success. It was like, you know, it had a fan club that had 15,000 members in it.
It was a big success until he took off the mask. Yeah, because nobody cared about Jimmy Ellis.
Nobody did. No.
So the name Orion was actually taken from a book that was big in the 70s, which was about a rock star faking his own death to get out of the spotlight. So I mean, the album, as you said, was called Reborn. It was obviously a bit of a ploy. It was a wee bit cynical. You know, they didn't say, oh, look, it's Elvis Presley, but they certainly liked playing with that and letting people think it. Orion, obviously, he quit after people just were indifferent when that mask came off, and, you know, I'd imagine that fan club was largely deranged, grieving Elvis fans, you know. He rebooted the project later, though. I think it was 1993 he started touring as Orion again. And he owned a pawn shop and was killed during an armed robbery of his own pawn shop. But yeah, I mean, Sun Records in particular were all over courting that link for a bit of cash. Did they claim it overtly? As I say, no. Did they do everything but claim it overtly? Arguably, yeah. And that kind of leads us to the main topic. What we are talking about, out and out catfish core here. So we got some good examples before we get to discussing Ghost Bath. So we got Platinum Weird. Now this is the one that actually brings in Christina Aguilera and stuff. So Dave Stewart,
documentary, yeah, you're right.
of the Eurythmics. Okay, now as the story goes, pre-Eurythmics, Dave Stewart and a woman called Erin Grace, they had an album, and everything was going well. The kind of Fleetwood Mac-y vibe to it. But Erin was apparently devastated by the death of the musician Nick Drake and chucked it all and ended up running off with Elton John's boyfriend. And gradually, over time, they thought this album had been lost. But But all these stories started to bubble up, and they learned that actually this early aborted project, Platinum Weird, had influenced all kinds of people, including Fleetwood Mac. Except that's all bollocks.
Mm-hmm.
It's all absolute bollocks. So the record
All
was
marketing.
Yeah, the record was written in 2004 when Dave Stewart was writing for the Pussycat Dolls, and they'd written this Fleetwood Mac-ish stuff that didn't fit with the Pussycat Dolls, but it was like, oh no, we should totally release this though. They even made a documentary featuring loads of famous faces, Christina Aguilera, which you said, but Mick Jagger, Elton John was on it, you know, obviously playing along with that whole thing of her running off with his boyfriend thing, all talking about what a great influence this album had been in their careers in the mid to late 70s. It's all bullshit. But in saying that, it's a bit of a laugh.
Yeah, see, if you go and listen to the record on Spotify, it said after the end of every track, it says 74 version. Yeah.
So one of the best and most relevant and contemporary examples is Syllable and Brains. Yep. Scottish example
Syllable.
as well.
Syllable and Brains.
Okay, Syllable, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, Catfish phenomenon in perfection here. And you're about to hear a whole lot more about these folks because James McAvoy is about to release a movie called California Scheming about this story. They were basically, I think it was originally 3 producers, although it's 2 folk by the time it gets to this stage. They were derided as the rapping proclaimers in their home city of Dundee. And they eventually became a faux American hip-hop duo in order to get picked up by Island Records on their first gig in London as a faux American hip-hop duo, I might add. And ultimately they ended up touring with D12, if you remember them, who were getting
Eminem's band.
Yep, a huge push for Eminem at the time. They spent 3 years in character. Now, you're going to see this all in the film if you go and see it. It does look like it'll be really good to try and make it work for one of the members, whose name was Billy Boyd. Very American name, that. Bailed out and back up the road to Dundee. And eventually the story actually became so notorious that they reformed and released new music.
Yeah, there was documentaries that came out. I think it was maybe about a few years ago.
Was it Storyville or something like that?
No, it's called the Great Hip Hop Hoax.
Hip Hop Hoax, that's right. Yeah.
And yeah, it's interesting. Like they even kept up the facade to their girlfriends at the time who thought they were American. You know,
that is absolutely mental.
Just
like,
insane.
That extent.
Yeah.
I mean, that we're just selling the movie at this point.
They were really good at that. Like they sounded like. Do you know what's interesting about it? See, if you listen to a few of their songs, they do drop in Scottish words, and it's kind of in the American accent. So they definitely knew what they were doing.
That's interesting.
You know.
So it's the prime example of faking something for an advantage. Okay, but I do want to caveat that because it's I see it's kind of like punching up. Do you know what I mean? So we're about to talk about Ghostbath, which I think is a slightly different scenario here, but this is like derided, patronised Scottish rappers punching up against a genre, a music industry that's dominated by American rap. Like that's a seal of like quality, like they can't get a look in, they're getting made fun of, and then they go and get signed on their first on their first show in London because they're putting on American accents effectively. So they turned the tables, and in doing so, I think they exposed quite a lot of hypocrisy, or shall we say hypocrisy, of the press and the industry. They were the same musicians, the same writers, but what changed was the context and the leniency, the subjective appraisal of those gatekeepers. And I think they're making a really interesting point by doing that. Yes, I'm sure it was nice to succeed for a while as well, but I don't begrudge them that because they were the little guy in that scenario, and the Ruse is quite funny because it's taken a shot at like the establishment, you know. Here's a really interesting one, and I do want to be really careful with this one because if anyone out there knows or has any further information on this one, tell me, right? But we don't know if this one is fake, and this could be extremely disrespectful. One day we might find out it was real, and if it was real, it's remarkable. But Janaza. So yeah, this potentially is either an incredible true story or absolutely fundamentally taps into the kind of distasteful exploitation we're talking about here. So I'm going to draw in stereo gum here. In 2012, The Atlantic magazine ran a feature about an anti-Islamic Iraqi band called Janaza, black metal sort of stuff. quote, believed to be Iraq's very first female-fronted black metal band. The implications of which were astounding. Such an act would literally face execution if their identities were to be discovered. Naturally, the band's frontwoman, Anahita, quote, refused to speak on the phone, instead insisting on communicating via Facebook. And people started to spot problems with the story, though. So, for example, the photos that were circulating had been stolen from elsewhere. And Anahita responded to that in an interview saying, again, a written interview, it's really stupid that people outside Iraq would really think that we have the power to publish our real photos. Okay, can I get that? They definitely don't want to get identified because their life would be in danger. The project only released one album, Burning Quran Ceremony, and has gone quiet, some would say suspiciously quiet, in the years since people started seriously questioning, are you actually an Iraqi woman, or is this just some mad sort of sardonic hoax? And we don't know. It could very well be as remarkable as it sounds at face value. And in that case, as I say, we're doing a massive disservice, especially because we don't know why the project went quiet. And that does make you think, oh, you know, what if they got caught? What if they got identified? I mean, certainly we would never find out what had happened to them in that scenario. But we do also have to reflect on the, should we say, scammy potential and the warning signs of the, you know, the fake publicity stuff and that. So we don't know. I think that's a really compelling one. I would love to know more about that one. And if anybody does happen to have any sort of insight on that, please let us know. Another one would be Velvet Cocoon. So perspectives on this one might also vary given the claims that this group make to satirising black metal, which in my humble opinion is a genre very deserving of being satirised. But money definitely changed hands, and there was outright plagiarism in this scenario and copyright infringement. So it's not a victimless crime, you know. Stereogum also did a dive in this group. It was two folk calling themselves SGL and LVG. They're also in real life known as Josh and Angela. They released an album called Dextronaut in 2002, but they said the record had initially been released in 1998, which was completely untrue, and that it had been preceded by a handful of ultra-rare demos, also completely untrue. In 2004, a second album came out called Genevieve, and they did what the writer called a handful of utterly bullshit-strewn interviews. They said the band had been a trio, not true. That they had the third member, the drummer, whose name was SKV, had fallen off a cliff and died, not true. They said their music was made using an instrument called a diesel harp, not true. They said their live shows were like, quote, bacchanals of self-mutilation, drug use and bloodletting, clearly not true. And they said they were a small segment of a large eco-terrorist group.
Wow.
Which was also not true. And in 2005, they released a demo called How the Last Day Came and Stayed, Then Faded into Simulated Rain. All of which, it later turned out, was stolen from a Portland artist called Miranda Lehman. Yeah. So around about that point, Josh, broke character and admitted in an interview that Velvet Cocoon had been a high-concept trolling designed to humiliate black metal fans and pocket their money in the same gesture. And, quote, even the people who hate us can't stop talking about us. How many bands can cause a reaction like we did? We pushed all the right buttons and everyone knows it. And they later published a statement, which I think they then deleted, saying the band is a total fraud. We're utter bastards. We have no respect for anything. So on one hand, it's just maximum trolling. It's just like pure, shithousery. But it also, Miranda Lehman, in this case, came a cropper because they had their stuff nicked. Which kind of brings us to Ghostbath. So this is the project, as I say, that kind of made me really curious about this whole phenomenon, right? Nowadays, Ghostbath, if you look them up, their press images are just this very normal photos of four hairy blokes that are in a band, open and visible, clearly them. But to be clear, those photos were not like that prior, okay? The photos previously were obscured, the faces at least, not the bodies. So their gender or their age, more or less, was not what was being concealed, but something else was being concealed, as in their ethnicity. Along with press releases and a general cat and mouse game of origins, there's a pattern of what I think appears to be deliberate obfuscation. And it's kind of hard to credibly disagree with that when you look into it more. So Vice did a big thing about this, and one of the articles they did, contrary to the band's comments, which blame the whole confusion on lazy journalism, it does turn out that the journalist in Vice finds their early press releases in Ghost Bath were claiming to be Chinese, right? For quite some time. So the conversation then kind of becomes, is that so wrong? I mean, China certainly isn't a minority culture, right? But there's no question, I think, that in this context it's been somewhat fetishized. Then again, this did get me thinking, right? So why is it being fetishized, right? Because it's a Chinese band and that's unusual, and they're from China. That's somewhere else, but they're doing something that we know. Oh, that's interesting. And you know what? There is an element of that happens to every band that goes on tour. As soon as you put a country on a poster, you know, there's a bit of interest, there's a bit of added prestige. You know, we are still the band we are when we were playing in Europe. We're still as wanting in ability as we always were. But as soon as you're in another country and it says Scotland, or unfortunately it says UK, you're like, oh, right. Oh, well, I'll go and see these guys. They're touring. They're from abroad. And that same happens over here. You know, bands hit the road, go to another country, and that sense of like, oh, they're from somewhere else. So is it just that? I don't think it's just that in the case of China. With a country like China, I mean, it's so insular, it's so culturally conservative in many ways that I think I don't think I'm the exception here. You get the impression that any extreme cultural export, whether it's a film, whether it's a book, whether it's art, or in this case music, if it's extreme, it's going to be extremely interesting because it's up against it in that culture to exist, really. Much like, talk about Short Paris, much like Short Paris in Russia. One of the things that made that so interesting was like, wow, this is really subversive. They're playing with sexuality a lot, they're playing with gender roles a lot, and it's politically subversive as well. So it invites questions about what it must be like to work on the margins in countries where people experience real, serious, life-changing repercussions to, I guess, what is fairly mundane activity for us in many parts of the West. You know, I think the same is very true of like Indonesian punk. There's a real fascination with Indonesian punk because in some of the islands it's a death sentence to be a punk in Indonesia. Same maybe could be applied to West African metal, which seems so anomalous to us, you know, real proper heavy metal, leather and studs and stuff like that, not least because it's so fucking hot. And even we saw a little bit of it when we were talking about Sanam, and there's a lot of DJs coming from the Middle East, and Middle Eastern electro is such a contemporary kind of like cultural thing coming from very conservative cultures in many cases, albeit the cities aren't always very conservative, but the context of the country around them, as we discussed on our Sanam episode, please go and listen to that if you've not heard it. So why am I so interested in Ghost Bath? I think it's partly because they played it badly. I don't mean the music, I mean the situation, right? Given that there was effectively hard evidence when it emerged that their press releases had, you know, said they were Chinese, I think they should just have fessed up at that point when those suspicions really arose. They could easily have played it off as a bit of mischief, maybe even they could have claimed to be satirising cultural relativism, you know, that kind of thing. And there maybe is an element of that, you know. It can be more than just one thing. And indeed, I've done something not entirely dissimilar with one of my projects before, leaving something ambiguous to see how people would react to it if they didn't know what it was. I don't think there's any real harm in that sort of mischief, especially in the context of art. And many people over the years have done something interesting with it, but it's how overt is a deception and what are the goals of that deception. I mean, Ghostbath chose to lie at one point at least. They were caught, they tried to bluff their way out of it, and they actually turned it on the journalists, and they became quite hostile, like criticising the press. Like, we just didn't correct you. You guys got it wrong. You're lazy journalists. It was all to do with the fact that to be on Bandcamp, you know, you kind of had to nominate a location to put you. So they said, oh, we just did that, and then you guys just read so much into that. But that turned out not to be true. They did make the point that so many people over the years as well, by the way, have claimed to be from Helvet. You know, they've claimed to be, or was it Hell in Michigan? There's a town called Hell. And so many, like a lot of metal bands have claimed to be Scandinavian or from one of the Norse countries. So given that they did that, and given that they then went on the attack against the journalists, it makes me kind of bounce off them in a way that some of the earlier ones we mentioned, I don't. I think it suggests slightly more nefarious motives in terms of trying to con their way into coverage through an appeal to novelty, which is
I agree.
culturally patronising.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I think it also, it leaves us as an audience asking questions about just how objective we are in our appraisal of works. You know, there is a useful function there. It's like, oh, I liked them when they were Chinese, now I don't like them, now they're not Chinese. So it does have the simultaneous effect of turning that lens on ourselves and making us go, am I a bit of a snob? Am I a bit of a hipster that I liked that when it was Chinese, but now that it sounds exactly the same, but it's from the States, do I not like that? What's going on with me?
It does affect it. It does affect the music, how you perceive the music, because if the band were Chinese and they were making stuff which sounded oddly contemporary, you'd be thinking, well, how are you hearing that? It's quite impressive.
Yeah.
You know, if you're hearing something that's like, because I'm sure their contemporary music is vastly different from what it is in the West, you know.
Well, again, to upsell a past episode, when we interviewed Xu Yin about China, about making music in China, the influences, what bands sound like. Do you get like Black Flag in China? Do you get, even like very contemporary stuff? Is there an Al Nathrak in China? Is there like a Tool in China? Like, what's it like? I mean, so it is interesting to hear the sound come back at you, because you're like, oh wow, I just assumed everything they hear is different, but actually they listen to a lot of the same stuff we do. But this example is no use at making that decision, because this is a fraud. It doesn't really tell you anything.
That's what I was saying. That's kind of what I'm getting at. So like, if they were legitimately Chinese and they were coming up with stuff which is contemporary Western music, you'd be like, oh, that's really cool, really impressive, and they're pretty good at it. But then once you realise that they're just another bunch of American folk, you're like, well, you're just doing something. You're just doing what you're listening. It's the context. Context matters. I think where someone comes from can play a part in influencing what you think about a piece of music.
There is a lot of cultural relativism in that. Just being devil's advocate.
There is.
We're basically saying, when we thought it was Chinese, we're saying, oh, this is a nice wee effort for a Chinese band. Patting them on the head. Well done, kids. Good effort. Good try. I mean, some places can be better at things than other places. America can be better at metal than China because it has a deeper tradition of it. Just like some places are better at pasta than others. It's like you have a deeper tradition of something. It's okay for America to be better at something because it's like got much more time and far more examples and a bigger pool of influence, than China. But I do think we do engage in a lot of cultural relativism. In some cases, maybe it's not a negative thing. I haven't really explored how I properly feel about things like that. Even the same can apply to things like queercore and things like that. Like, how good is this band? Should I like them more to be supportive, or should I simply be objective and say, well, they're not very good, so I don't give a shit if they're this or that. That's a huge different conversation, but this does really highlight that to me. And I mean, we spoke about that another past episode, the pitchfork effect. There's a lot of that about gatekeeping and coolness and places that pick up on a particular agenda around a piece of music or an act or a movement, and then really shove it in your face. And I think there's no question that Ghostbath were using the Chinese thing to try and short circuit that system. I mean, they got signed to a Chinese label though, which is fascinating. And the label were pissed off. The label basically threatened to drop them, and then there was a period of sort of like consideration, and then the label decided to keep them and said, after we got over our anger at the deception, we did re-listen to all their music and agreed that it was still very good music and we were happy to stand by it, but basically with a renewed relationship of like openness, because but they didn't just hoax the West. They hoaxed the Chinese as well and got signed in China as a result of that. But again, was that a shortcut? Yeah.
Do you think it would have been it would have been more egregious if they'd actually incorporated like Chinese musical influences into the music and then claimed to be Chinese?
Possibly. I mean, they used Chinese artwork and they used Chinese writing, and in fact if you translated the names from Chinese writing, they were like normal names. You know, it's just because most of us don't need Mandarin or Cantonese. So there was an element of transparency to the deception if you really looked for it.
Yeah.
So that was kind of what they fell back on. It's like, oh, it was there if you wanted to find it. But then again, you're like, but guys, you did like claim to be at one point. That's the problem. That was the original sin that you can't get past, that you can't just sort of hand wave away here. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, in one sense, it's weird to say punching down when you're talking about China, because it's fucking hegemony, right? Hegemony?
Hegemony.
Yeah. Economically and culturally, at least. But, you know, it's a minority of a minority when it comes to extreme music. And so you're laying claim to novelty, as I said, and even calling it novelty. You're laying claim to novelty, and in doing so, making them feel like a novelty. It's objectifying in a way, so it does feel disrespectful. I'm sure the Chinese people, great bunch of lads, are not going to cry themselves to sleep. But yeah, it does feel a little bit distasteful. Moonlover, by the way, the album that they've got multiple releases now, but Moonlover, the album that was really at the heart of that when the story broke, is decent. It's fine. It's dreamgaze, which is not really my thing, as you know, but there's nothing too offensive about it. If you're into, I don't know, if you liked Sundowner by Deaf Heaven, you'll probably quite like it. Could they have made the grade on their own merits? I don't have an answer to that.
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the ultimate question, I think.
I think you know, maybe as the label said in China, when you listen to it, you're like, yeah, I mean, it's no better or worse than a lot of stuff that's out there. And given how arbitrary success seems to be for a lot of these projects, then yeah, it very possibly could. They sort of set themselves up for failure, given that the ruse was eventually going to be found out, not least when they played live, and therefore they were going to run out of road at some point when people started being like, wait a minute, not only am I now appraising you by the same standards as everybody else, but I'm also a bit pissed off at you because you lied about it. So I don't really have an answer. Maybe the audience can listen to the record and make their own minds up, or maybe the audience don't feel they deserve the listens because ultimately they're only getting this coverage that even right now because of what they did. So don't know.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, you know. You also need to kind of wonder if it was maybe just like a wee bit of a joke that had just gone too far. Yeah, you know, like they got in it. You know, that's why I don't like the lack of climb down, because I think it's possible to get swept up in something. I think there's loads of great examples of that in history of things that got, you know, took on a life of their own. But I think you ultimately have to fess up rather than entrenching yourself, and especially rather than being hostile with journalists and being like, oh, yous are lazy journalists and that, you know, things like that. It's that's bad form. Yeah, it's like, even if it is a joke, that's just sour grapes at the end of the day, innit? It's like, you shouldn't react like that. You should just say, all right, we thought it was funny. It's no funny. Yeah, I mean, you know? And they would have been in a great position to be like, but don't you feel silly as a journalist that you gave us coverage just because you thought we were a different race? You know, and at that point, you're like, oh, cool. Well, you're making a provocative point, and that's fair game. But they kind of gave up that high ground, any argument of a high ground that they had. Yeah. Well, that's been really interesting, I think. Hopefully people have learned something and they've heard some music that they like or not. Whatever, I guess, you know. Yep. You can. Oh, there's loads more stories, and if you are, if you're in the AAA group, or if you're just listening casually, you can go on one of our socials and comment with any particularly good examples of this that we've missed. And as I said, if you know anything about that Iraqi or supposedly Iraqi project, Janaza, then I'd love to find out if anybody ever, you know, got to the bottom of that, because I do worry about defaming it, especially if something potentially awful happened to somebody who was taking a real risk making it. But then again, it could just have been some Snyder in a bedroom in Derby, you know. Aye, yeah. Well, thanks very much. These bloody Iraqi women, they got all the breaks. We are pure cis white male in my early 30s. Can I get a fair crack of the whip? I'll show them. You just hear that, you can see it. Fuck yeah. It's too real, man. It's too real. Yeah. Thanks very much for listening. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please like, share and subscribe. If you're on YouTube, of course. If you're not, then just share it with your friends and, you know, share it on your social media. Tag people. Yeah, tag people. Tag people is really handy. Yeah. And you can... Oh, was it on Instagram? You
DM it, you'd be getting extra plaudits from
If you
Instagram.
send it directly to somebody,
Mark Zuckerberg personally phones us up
Yeah.
and says, "Nice job,
good job,
bruv."
Yeah. And if you want to support the podcast, patreon.com/unsungpod. We will be back in 2 weeks' time with something just as cool.
And if you want to know who Banksy is, buy me a pint.
Yeah. See you later. Give me a clap.
3, 2, 1.
Hey. Hey folks, it's Unsung. I'm going to start again. Hey folks, welcome to the Unsung Podcast.